The Caribbean sun beat down on the USS George H.W. Bush, turning its steel deck into a shimmering griddle. The air was thick with salt, jet fuel, and hot metal. Below, the endless blue ocean stretched in every direction. For thousands aboard, it was just another patrol. May 18, 2024. The carrier projected American power, conducting freedom of navigation exercises in a region growing more unstable by the day. On deck, ground crews in colored jerseys prepped F-18 Super Hornets for launch, engines roaring in a deafening symphony. Young sailors worked with focus, their mission clear: maintain readiness, deter aggression, be prepared for anything. The biggest concern seemed to be the heat, until now. Deep inside, the Combat Information Center was a world of glowing screens and data points. Radar operators scanned the skies, tracking every blip, commercial, military, or otherwise. This was the carrier's nerve center, where threats would first appear. The calm above was only possible because of the vigilance below. The U.S. presence in the Caribbean was routine, but recent years had brought new urgency. Venezuela's collapse created a volatile security situation, and the Navy's presence was meant to stabilize. But to Caracas, it was a provocation. On this calm May morning, those perspectives were about to collide. The routine was about to be shattered. The biggest threat was no longer the heat. Something was coming. The first sign was subtle, a fast, unidentified blip on the CIC radar. It was heading straight for the carrier group. At first it could have been a glitch, but it didn't disappear. The radar operator tagged it. Bogey bearing 270, range 200 miles inbound. The calm in the room vanished. The crew tried to hail the aircraft. Unidentified aircraft, this is a US Navy warship. Please identify yourself. Silence. The blip kept coming, its speed unmistakably military. The possibility of a mistake faded with every mile. The captain was notified. Officers scanned the horizon. The alert status was raised. On deck, 2 Super Hornets were prepped for a Ready 5 launch. Pilots sprinted to their jets, faces set with determination. The carrier turned into the wind for rapid launch. The contact closed fast. 100 miles, 75, 50. It was no civilian airliner. The radar signature was a fighter jet. Then, a second blip appeared, flying in tight formation. 2 bogies, descending rapidly. The lack of communication was now overtly hostile. The question was no longer what they were, but why they were here. On the bridge, every sailor knew a confrontation was imminent. The blue Caribbean sky suddenly felt threatening. The clock was ticking. The carrier was moments from crisis. The air was electric with tension. Every eye was on the screens. Every second mattered. The unknown was closing in. The calm was gone. The standoff had begun. To understand the tension, you have to know the history. U.S.-Venezuela relations had soured for decades, with Caracas accusing Washington of imperialism and plotting to steal oil. Venezuela's economic collapse and disputed elections only deepened the divide. The U.S. backed opposition leader Juan Guaidó, imposed sanctions, and refused to recognize Maduro. To Maduro's regime, this was an existential threat. The presence of a U.S. carrier off their coast was seen as the ultimate provocation. The Venezuelan military was on high alert, fed a steady diet of anti-American propaganda. They believed the U.S. was at their doorstep, ready to strike. On one side, a U.S. Navy enforcing global norms. On the other, a cornered regime fighting for survival. Each saw the other as the aggressor. The Caribbean had become a geopolitical fault line. The airspace above was a powder keg. The 2 F-16s screaming toward the carrier were the spark. The stage was set for confrontation. The jets approaching the carrier were F-16 Fighting Falcons, American-made, bought by Venezuela in the 1980s. Now, they were flown by a hostile air force. The Venezuelan Air Force prized these jets, symbols of national power. Despite sanctions and shortages, they kept some F-16s flying, cannibalizing parts and relying on help from Iran and Russia. Their pilots were elite, aggressive, and deeply indoctrinated. Flying the F-16 was a prestigious role. These pilots saw themselves as defenders against foreign aggression. The F-16 is agile, fast, and deadly, even in older versions. In skilled hands, it's a lethal weapon. The pilots knew their aircraft's limits and how to use them to intimidate. Their mission was framed as a sovereign patrol, but their flight path told another story. They were intercepting, sent to make a statement. For these pilots, this was national defiance. David against Goliath. They weren't out to destroy, but to send a message. The F-16s were more than machines. They were symbols. The pilots were ready to risk everything. The confrontation was personal. The world was watching. The Venezuelan F-16s closed to within 20 miles. The U.S. Super Hornets were ready, but time was short. Suddenly, one F-16 split off, circling high, while the other dove steeply toward the carrier. The jet's nose pointed directly at the USS George H.W. Bush. On deck, the shriek of the jet cut through the air. For a moment, it looked like an attack run. Sailors ducked instinctively. There was nowhere to hide. The F-16 leveled out just above the waves, aiming for a low pass. At that speed and altitude, any error could be catastrophic. The jet flashed over the flight deck, a blur of gray and camouflage, no more than 500 feet above. The roar shook the ship. Sailors glimpsed the pilot in the cockpit. Then, the F-16 pulled into a steep climb, afterburner blazing. The two jets turned back toward Venezuela. The U.S. Navy was left stunned and furious. The danger had passed, but the message was clear. On the bridge, the captain and officers watched with disbelief and cold professionalism. The ship's defensive systems locked onto the incoming jet. The captain had seconds to decide: fire and risk war, or hold and risk destruction. The jet showed no hostile intent, no open weapons bays, no fire control radar. The captain held fire, trusting his judgment. It was a decision that saved lives. For sailors on deck, the experience was raw: fear, then anger at the reckless endangerment. For the Venezuelan pilot, it was a triumph, a message delivered, a challenge met. He'd risked everything for a political point. In Caracas, it would be seen as a victory. On the carrier, it was a violation. The line between war and peace had never felt thinner. As the F-16s vanished, a tense silence settled over the carrier. The Super Hornets finally launched, now just to patrol. Every detail of the encounter was logged for the Pentagon. The diplomatic fallout was immediate. The U.S. condemned the unsafe maneuver, releasing dramatic video to the world. Venezuela claimed their jets were defending sovereign airspace, hailing the pilot as a hero. Both sides hardened their positions. The U.S. Navy adjusted its rules of engagement, lowering the threshold for hostile acts. Venezuela's military was emboldened. The close call was a stark reminder of the dangers of military standoffs. The world hadn't gone to war, but the risk of miscalculation had grown. The incident was over, but the consequences lingered. The powder keg remained. This close call was more than a dramatic story. It was a lesson in the fragility of peace. Around the world, such encounters are dangerously common. A single mistake or reckless act can ignite conflict. The USS George H.W. Bush, a symbol of power, was held at risk by one older jet. The captain's restraint was true strength. Peace is maintained by the weapons we choose not to use. The silence from the Venezuelan jet was the most threatening part. When communication breaks down, fear takes over. The fate of nations can rest on a single decision, made in seconds. The story is a cautionary tale. Peace is not permanent, but a constant process. The world is full of powder kegs. The survival of peace depends on those willing to step back from the brink.